Okay, hello everyone. Very welcome to North Houston Space Society's meeting. I'm Masa Spandabadi and I have graduated from University of Houston, Aerospace Architecture. I do habitats design for Mars and Moon. And I'm at the Space Architecture Educational Subcommittee and Space Architecture Educational Committee of AIAA. So anything about space and education of this space, I'm really interested in.
Is that you?
Yep. Okay, is it working now? Yeah, that was my picture in a art gallery. It was a painting of a moon and it was really nice. So our agenda, like always, we started two. We have some intro and then we have the most recent space news. Dr. Greg Stanley will talk about the very interesting what has happened in the past month. And then Nathan is going to talk about going to Interstellar. And after that, we're having some Q&A and we have a short introduction about next month. We have board members election and how you can participate in that and how we can involve with that. And then that's it. And we hope we can finish by 4. Okay, so lots of people, they ask, where's the future of humanity? Are we going to just stay on Earth or we're going to end up on Moon, Mars, Titan, or orbit? The one on top left, the Moon one, that's my design and we did it for NASA and we're waiting for fundings. The one on right is another design from my old company. And these two, Titan and orbit, are proposals that probably you have heard about. So everyone has a passion. Some people, they call themselves moon people and some people, they call themselves Mars people. So maybe we can agree on something, and that's Earth is not the only solution. We need another planet to survive. So what we do in National Space Society is that people living and working and thriving communities beyond the Earth, and this is the motto of the National Space Society, that we can use the vast resources of space for the dramatic betterment of humanity. So it's not just having a settlement over there. We need to have greenhouses, we need to have infrastructures, we need to have satellite and everything all together. So maybe one time we can have some fancy sports in orbit or on other planets. So what does North Houston Space Society help other people? So we want to try to educate citizens in North Houston Space Society about what is going about in space exploration and development, and maybe hopefully we can inspire people about the future of the space mission. We try our best to encourage students, if they show up in the meetings, they're usually doing it online. And for space dreams and careers in space exploration, we try our best to help parents to encourage their daughters or their sons and their kids or teachers to move forward in this path and make it more accessible for new generations. And we try to open the eyes of investors and potential space businesses. Also, we try, the main purpose we're gathering here, and connect the space exploration enthusiasts all together in one place and spend a couple of hours together and talk about the interesting stuff. So if you want to involve in the board meeting, you can join in northhoustonspace.org. For the election, you can go to our website, accept the joining the whole community. You can apply to being on board. We'll talk about it later. And you can do these steps, and it's very easy, it's very cheap, it's very affordable. Please do it. We'll record the whole presentations, and it will be available on YouTube, and you can watch it later if you couldn't attend it. And for those people who are at home, this is how you can start your video sharing. You can mute or unmute and ask questions. And you can chat with us and drop your questions or your comments, and I'm going to read it loud. And if you have any questions, if we don't say it, you can just simply raise hand. We're going to respond to that. And the most wonderful human being, Dr. Greg Stanley. And how can I describe it? Dr. Greg Stanley is mostly retired, creates, develops, and manages innovative technology, especially based on artificial intelligence. He has PhD in chemical engineering from Northwestern University, bachelor's in chemical engineering from Purdue University, and he has published over 25 peer-reviewed technical papers. He works and on a variety of projects and on different companies, including Exxon, Gensen, AT&T, Intelsat, and Visphere 2, and lots of other interesting companies. So now I'm introducing you to Vice President of Northeastern Space Society.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah. Maybe people would like to move up. It's kind of hard to hear with all the noise, I realize. So it's not that crowded. You could easily move in a little bit.
Can we turn off the speaker in this room?
No, I don't think we can, because it's the same one that's out there.
Can you try sending back and forth?
Okay, well, what's that other thing showing there? Okay, well, this is the monthly space news. We have this once a month, as you would guess, to go along with our meetings. So that's what we're going to start with. So we'll start right off with low Earth orbit news. One thing that's just going on is the Chinese space station. Now that's been up there for a little bit. It has this core module that starts, that started everything off. They've had several cargo craft. They're shown there on the ends. One of those, the most recent one came in, completely automated. There were no people there at the time. But anyway, this last month, during the month, they sent up the crew, the next crew. This is the second crew for them, and that's what that looks like right there. So their target is to complete 3 main modules by 2022, and they have the possibility of expanding to 6. They're trying to involve a lot of other people, just like the International Space Station, just like we did with that. So they're trying to, set that up, same kind of thing. So this second crew will be there anyway for 6 months. Okay, there might be a whole lot more space stations galore that could come up.
This crew, this is the second female crew member that the Chinese have.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, at least there. Yeah. Anyway, there is one. Yeah.
Crew 3. Yeah, there was one before. And
yeah.
This is the second one. So they seem to be showing a commitment to getting the other half of the human race involved.
They're out there, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yep.
They are. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, actually, the Russians have done that to some extent. Although it's kind of funny, they had a story recently about how the space station toilets, the Russians never really had one that accommodated the women very well. The Americans do. And they were hoping that with that recent movie filming they were doing up there, that the actress would try both and give a report, but apparently nobody's saying anything. So who knows how that's going to work out. Anyway, there might be a whole lot more space stations up there, and that's driven by the fact that the International Space Station, the end is in sight. And originally it was funded through 2024. That'll probably go to 2028, maybe 2030. It's not really established that well, but it's getting old. There are stress cracks, especially in the very first module that went up, the Russian one, the Zarya module. That went up in 1998. So it's been there a while. It's been exposed to all kinds of stresses and particles and so on. Looking back at the history of this thing, it cost about $150 billion to build this. And about $4 billion a year to operate. Now that includes, a lot of scientific experiments and so on. So there's a lot going on with that, but it is very expensive. And they don't really have figures for what a lot of these newer stations may cost, but we're talking like 1/10 to 100th the cost is kind of what people are thinking. The first time you do this kind of thing, it just costs you a lot more money. but technology has improved, people have gotten better, they figured out how to do things more reasonably. The next generation of space stations are a lot cheaper, than the original one.
So not just 1/10 as much to build, but perhaps 1/10 as much to
The operations,
operate.
yeah.
Yeah, okay,
I think they're mainly focusing right now just on what it takes to build, because
yeah,
who's to say what's going to be done in these things? I mean, the assumption is you get a certain amount of tourism, you get a certain amount of microgravity research where you try to figure out how to make something in space that maybe you can make more effectively, like growing artificial hearts or something. And whenever one of those really takes off, then that says, aha, then we can expand really fast, and we need a place to do that.
What will they do with the old space station?
Well, that's to be determined. Yeah, I mean, there are some people that say, well, it's an awful lot of mass that we've gone to a lot of expense to put up there. Let's do something with it, and it's not known. Basically, let's say there's no plans anyway. Now, one of the stations, this Axiom space station, this one right here, this one starts off actually attached to the existing ISS. They're going to put that up. Was it next year?
3 years.
Yeah, 2024. Anyway, yeah. So the very first module. Let's see. Is this a pointer? Where's the pointer on this thing? No. Well, yeah, but it should be on here, I think. Is there a pointer on this? It's not a laser? Look, it should be. Oh, there it is. Okay, good. Anyway, so the one plan is from a company called Axiom. This is the only one that's actually funded right now. They got $140 million from NASA for launching in 2024. And it starts, this is just this very first module. That's the one that's actually funded. It's attached, if you look closely, this is shown attached to the International Space Station. The idea is you get it up there, you get it going and established, and then they'll add additional modules. There's an observation module here, and then several others. The idea is that even when the ISS is finally removed, however that's done, they would just detach. And so that station will continue. So that's one of the possible outcomes is you could take some of the modules of the space station, and maybe reuse some of them. Some of those modules just went up there. They haven't even been there that long. It'd be a shame for them to go to waste. Okay, so anyway, among the space stations, so we talked about the Chinese space station. Of course, we have the International Space Station. And we talked about Axiom, which is the first one to actually get funded. There we go. But two other companies have come in. One is, there's a project called Orbital Reef, and this is put out by Blue Origin. They just announced this one fairly recently, this last month. And this is a joint project with Sierra Space and Boeing and some others, some more minor players that will be in there. That one's kind of interesting in a lot of ways. The Sierra Space, they had their own version of a space station plan already, and it involved an inflatable module. And if you look down here, for instance, this little section right here in the lower right corner, that would be an example of an inflatable modules included. So all that kind of stuff was pioneered by Bigelow originally. They're out of business now. They're actually never went bankrupt. They just fired everybody, and they're just kind of sitting there doing nothing. But that idea has gone on. So there's an inflatable module for them. With the Blue Origin project. Also NanoRack, same thing, a Houston company. They're also going to have some inflatable portions to the modules for their own space station. So that general strategy of inflating things seems to have really stuck. It's definitely happening. Anyway, so all these space stations probably will not happen. Maybe one or more might. But there have been failures, Bigelow being one. Another one, Orionspan. We actually had the CTO of Orionspan give a speech here a couple of years ago. They went out of business. They couldn't make it. So it's not an easy business to be in. You basically look to get an anchor tenant like NASA, to provide you with a steady source of funding, and then you try to get other people to buy in. Typically, doing research, whether it was on biomedical kinds of things or materials, whatever that might be. Oh, okay, that was just a blow up of the Axiom there. Okay, now this is the Blue Origin. This is their glossy literature. This is what this looks like. It's a little bit strange. It gives you the feeling it's sort of like an Apple store, except not cluttered. If you want to imagine the the aesthetic. They don't actually show anybody doing any actual work. They don't really show any actual equipment or anything actually happening. So this is definitely pretty much just at the PR stage at this point. They had a lot of fun. Some people pointed out that they are going for having a lot of big open spaces. And of course, the problem with that is that you might get stuck there. Now, but maybe the idea is, okay, you take a piece of clothing, you throw it off, and that gives you enough reaction to get you back. You'll notice they do have, they do have handrails up toward the top, which you would need, because basically, you might be floating around anywhere and you need to grab onto something. But anyway, this design aesthetic, it looks nice in principle, but what actually happens is this. This is the International Space Station. This is an actual picture, it's from the NASA website. I don't know which particular module this is, but that's more what really happens. I was reading somewhere that among other things, among all the stuff that's up there, there's 6,000 objects that have been lost. So that kind of, so that gives you an idea of what actually happens, in the real world. Anyway, moving on, other uses for the space station, the Russians made a movie there, or made a portion of a movie to be exact. That just happened in this last month here. An actress played a surgeon making an emergency house call to the ISS. And so they've been up and back already during this last month. Some minor drama, the automated docking of the Soyuz capsule that brought them up there, it broke down. They had to dock manually. It didn't cause them any problem. But maybe a little more seriously, the Russians, for the second time, accidentally fired a thruster, which totally tilted the space station. It took them about 20 minutes or 30 minutes to recover. But that's the second time they've done this. And it was even a different piece of equipment that did it. So, the Russians are getting careless, I guess, would be one way to put it. Space tourism, this is just suborbital with Blue Origin. Captain Kirk from Star Trek, William Shatner, he finally made it up there. He got a free ride, by the way, in case you're wondering. He didn't have to pay for that. The PR value was probably worth it. He also now is the oldest person to go into space. He's 90. So there's still hope for a few of you. You could be. Now, Prince William of the British royal family, he was not happy about this. He sort of basically taking a stance that we're wasting our money on space. And I think actually this is getting to be a serious issue. I think people are framing, and he said something about we need the world's greatest brains, working on saving the planet and not in space. It's getting to be an issue. And I think people need to take a step back. It's a false dichotomy. It's not either or. You don't spend the money on this or that. Actually, you look at all the environmental projects, in particular climate modeling, it depends completely on monitoring from space, all those satellites that are up there. I mean, and you think about things like GPS, which in fact has probably saved more fuel, which has actually helped the planet. But all the data that goes into all these models they're making, temperatures, cloud cover, the extent of ice coverage, the atmospheric composition at all different levels, deforestation or land use in general, all these things kind of work their way into climate modeling and the solar input. The reality is they couldn't even build these models and even tell how things are going if they didn't have satellite monitoring. So, they're needed for each other. And conversely, looking at it another way, modeling the environment is something you kind of need to really settle space. So far we're just doing everything mechanically, but to really spread into space, we have to really better understand how the environment actually works. And we need that. This feeds back, in fact, to the environmental stuff today, in that when you look at experiments like Biosphere 2, you can see what happens on a much shorter time scale. If you say CO2 levels go up or temperatures go up or whatever it is you're looking at, you want to see the effects, you can see it much, much faster in the controlled experiments that are exactly the kind of things we need to do to figure out how to settle space. So that these should not be allowed to be argued as being separate and competing projects. They really go together. And you look at it in the back, even a joyride or an astronaut ride, to get a view of Earth, like the blue marble, this blue marble, that single picture, kind of energized the environmental movement in the US and the world, because that was the first time they really had a view of Earth as a whole. People imagined it, but this was a real picture, and that actually was helpful. So I think we as people who are interested in space need to kind of push back when people make these arguments that we should, only spend money on saving the Earth. We are saving the Earth. And most generally, as is the purpose of this organization, the resources of space will enrich humankind. And the resources are material, it's energy, and it's also places to go, to settle or even just to visit. you know, we're going to have things coming like space solar power, a lot of specialized industries. We'll figure out what they are. You know, we're getting closer. Specialized industries that really will work best in space, and new technologies. And we'll have the opportunities for different kinds of governments to experiment with new challenges for the human spirit, so we don't just kind of decay and, you know, get bored. And of course, surviving the cataclysms. So for all those reasons, I think Prince William may be unhappy, but he needs to get over it. Okay, next, changing topics completely. We just launched a probe to explore asteroids, and this is a probe. It's called Lucy, and it's going to explore the asteroids that are near Jupiter. And they're basically trapped by Jupiter's gravity at what's called the L4 and L5 Lagrange points. I'll show that in a picture in the next slide. But there's a special reason for going to visit those asteroids, in that they've probably pretty much been untouched compared to what was happening 4 billion years ago. They're in a stable orbit. They probably haven't been banged up as much, you know, as other asteroids that are out there. And so they're going to get very detailed images and analysis. They're going to estimate temperatures, mass, and so on. One interesting thing about this particular probe is it's solar powered. Most of the truly deep space probes we've ever done have all been nuclear powered because there's a nice steady source of energy. This one's solar, which actually caused a problem. This picture turned out to be quite accurate. The way it was set up, these solar arrays start off completely folded up. They're kind of unfold like a fan, you know, as a circle. And one of them opened up completely, and the other one didn't quite make it. It's probably 60 to 80% open. They're still working out exactly what happened there. And they haven't come up with a plan on what to do about it. They're saying that they're getting enough power, but, you know, there's a question of if it's not latched properly, you know, how will that handle the stresses that come up with spaceflight? So that it remains to be seen how that'll work out. This is a very complicated flight. To do this trip, to visit all these asteroids, we start off, it goes around the Earth actually twice, or goes around the sun actually twice, getting gravity assist, you know, essentially coming close to Earth and let the Earth pull it along a little bit. And then it finally swings out to the first group of Trojans, which are at the Lagrange L4 point, which is way out there. Circles back, makes one more pass around the sun, get us a third gravity boost from Earth, and then finally swings out to go to here. And then, you know, if there's anything, if the thing is still surviving, they'll figure out where to send it next. But at least this is what's part of the official plan. It takes, what did I say, 12 years to do this thing. We fly by the Earth 3 times to get a gravity assist. Very complicated trajectory, but this is the kind of planning that has to go on. And they are then the most distant use of solar power. I mentioned the solar power. It has 18,000 watts of power around Earth, but out there, it only has 500. So, and yet that's enough. That's enough to run the main instruments and to keep themselves warm enough. Okay, moving on to some other controversies that have happened here. SLS, the Space Launch System. This one's been kind of in trouble for a while, but some background on this. This was started in 2011, government project, NASA project. Boeing as a prime contractor got started in 2011. Originally, it was estimated to cost about $10 billion, and it was going to launch in 2016. Well, it hasn't launched yet, and they've spent about $21 billion so far. The cost figures have a little bit of flexibility in them because, you know, how much is included? Do you include all the ground facilities or not? But it's probably around $21 billion. This originally was set up to use old space shuttle engines for the first 4 flights. So there's 4 of them on each one. So the first 4 flights are using actually space shuttle era engines. That was a congressional mandate. It was part of the legislation that actually got this thing started. And then after that, then Aerojet, which is the contractor that builds the engines, is essentially just, they have updated versions of these, but there's almost the same engines. So they're doing that. There were a lot of complaints through the years that essentially that was a way to just lock in all the existing contractors. You know, so the suggestion was it was more based on political concerns. Congress people had their particular, you know, companies building their stuff. Yeah.
Another way to phrase that would be to avoid job layoffs.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a tradition in the defense industries. We've talked about that before, that normally you want to keep your industrial base going. And so even when people lose contracts, they give some money, you know, kind of secondary level. The problem with that is that it doesn't really encourage innovation very much. You know, you tend to get kind of stuck in the way you were doing things before because you keep extending the same technology with the same people. So there's pluses and minuses of that approach. Anyway, the SLS is a key part of the Artemis program, which is the back to the moon, you know, get people back in 2024 and so on. But because of all the delays and the cost increases, SLS has been dropped earlier this year on the Europa Clipper mission, which is a mission to Europa. And anyway, one thing that's kind of interesting in all this is that back when they started SLS, Bill Nelson, who now is the head of NASA, he was a senator who was one of the big proponents of it. So he has a kind of personal stake in it. And of course, actually, Florida ended up getting, you know, a lot of the dollars directed to them because all the ground facilities and everything. So he's kind of intimately involved in it. What's actually got a lot of people up in arms at this point is that he's just put out a request for information now that he's head of NASA. He wants a proposal by January for how to fly SLS for the next 30 years. And with just one, but only specifying one crewed flight per year, you know, and maybe some other flights they're not with the crew. And the words that were actually used were sustainable and affordable. And what that means is they're looking for them to come up with a way to save 50% on the cost of these rockets. They never actually said 50% off what, so that's interesting. But there have been various estimates over time, and the estimates have not been good. The Europa mission, I think they figured that, they rated that one at roughly $1 billion as kind of an incremental cost for one flight. The Office of Management Budget, which is an official White House organization, they actually figured it was more like $2 billion back in 2019. The cost estimates do make some assumptions on how many launches you have, of course. So, you know, these numbers are a little hard to come up with. But there is no official estimate, but NASA has never really complained when people said it cost $2 billion a flight for this. Now, what's interesting is if you look at what the competition is coming, Starship, for instance, from SpaceX, the units of measure are in millions, not billions. So it kind of gives you an idea of the differences that are coming. Okay, so the detractors say that the competition could offer much lower costs, basically newer rockets. What they really mean right now is SpaceX, but it could be others, you know, coming along as well, like Blue Origin or somebody. But the arguments that the detractors make are that, first of all, the technology just changes faster. We shouldn't be planning any rockets being around for 30 years. It's probably just not a good idea. They're basically saying that this kind of stuff is kind of NASA and defense style pork. You know, you're pleasing Congress because people were preserving jobs in their districts and so on. But the big thing driving it all is SpaceX proved that reusability of rockets, even just the first stage, makes a tremendous difference in the cost. It lowers it a lot. And so they're ahead right now, but the entire industry is basically, everybody's trying to plan out how are they going to make this shift to making everything reusable. And certainly all the newer ones coming in are making that assumption. Yeah.
Speak briefly about the others and what they are offering in terms of a reusable rocket. Just very briefly.
Well, okay. Well, if you look at Rocket Lab, right now they didn't start off doing reusable stuff, but they're just getting into that now. Now they're smaller. They're doing the smaller kind of stuff, but that's one. The Relativity Space, which is a startup which is backed by Mark Cuban and a bunch of other people, they are all assuming everything is reusable. And by reusable, I mean not just the first stage like the Falcon 9, but also the second stage, or basically every part of the craft would be reusable.
Are the majors doing anything in that direction?
Who?
Lockheed, Boeing. Are they still focused on?
They're still, yeah. I can't answer that. I don't actually. I know what they're doing, but basically any of the new space stuff coming along is all doing that. Now, of course, the big thing, I mean, you got to say about SLS, it is big, you know, and it's you're not going to go up and buy from Rocket Lab, you know, something anywhere near this scale. The Starship it's pretty close. It's actually not quite as big, perhaps, but being reusable. The argument is that all these things were based kind of on the Apollo model, where you had this one giant ship and it just goes up and it does the whole mission. And what people are saying is, well, you can get fuel, you can launch up to space, and then you can refuel in orbit. And the thing is, given that the given that it costs so much less with reusable rockets to get that fuel up there, you can basically do that refueling, even if you have to make 5 or 6 trips up to fill up a new rocket up in orbit. It ends up that you can use smaller ships and you can get by much, much cheaper. So that's the current argument that's coming along. Then there's just the whole cost issue. Starship, they're estimating about a $5 billion total cost to develop the whole thing. That compares, pretty favorably to what the 20 billion plus that we're at with SLS. And one of the other problems is that in this request for information that went out, 1 flight per year is really not enough to achieve cost savings. You're not mass producing rockets at that point. You're still custom crafting them. No one but NASA would probably pay that price. So you're never going to get the volume you need, with the current SLS plans. Now, you can turn this around though. There are those who think that this recent maneuver by Nelson is actually a way to force Boeing and Congress to give up on SLS. And the reason being that they're not going to be able to come up with a decent proposal. It seems very unlikely. There's just no way you're going to make it sustainable and affordable. It's just going to be way more expensive than the other alternatives. And maybe this will be a way to force the issue. NASA's been kind of dancing around it for a long time. I mean, there's been dissension within NASA, on how to go. And there were a lot of people in NASA. I mean, that this was their life. They were building, creating this thing too. But definitely in Congress, you had the same kind of situation. You had people who were tied to the existing contractors. So who knows where it's going to go, but that's where it stands right now. Okay, other controversies going on. This one at least may be resolved. Remember that Blue Origin did not get a contract for the human landing system, which is getting people from lunar orbit down to the surface of the moon in 2024. They had protested. There was a bit that thing, they held up things for a while with that. That protest got overruled, then they sued. And now the suit has finally been overturned by a judge. And at this point, Jeff Bezos, who heads up Blue Origin, he conceded pretty much gracefully, basically saying good luck. And he did say that he would not try to appeal it and drag this out anymore. So I have to give him some credit for that. But as people know, Bezos and Elon Musk of SpaceX, they have a grudge match going on in tweets all the time. There's tweet storms. And Musk, of course, followed along suit. He quoted a 1995 movie, Judge Dredd. He said, "You have been judged." Now, anybody who's ever seen that movie, Judge Dredd, which is it's a futuristic kind of thing, it's not pretty when you get judged. So this was the results are not pretty. Let's just put it that way. Okay, moving along, the X-37. This is something we don't even hear much about. Well, part of the reason is it's a classified program, so it's not surprising you wouldn't hear too much about it. What are they? Well, it's run by the U.S. Originally started by NASA, actually, then turned over to DARPA for a while, but it's been a military program for quite a while. What is it? Essentially it's a small-scale space shuttle, if you will, except it's robotic. So it's a reusable craft, like a space shuttle. It's autonomous, which is different. You don't need people to run it. It is a mini version of the shuttle. And it is built by Boeing. It has been flying for a while. It's about a quarter of the size of the shuttle. And so the wingspan of 15 feet, 29 feet long, quite a bit smaller. You can see on the runway here, if you look closely, there's some people. You can see you get a feel of the size. This is much smaller than a space shuttle. It has a payload. It has a payload bay like the size of a pickup truck. So you can put satellites in there and launch them, or you can run experiments, and that's pretty much what they're doing. It's launched from an Atlas V or a Falcon 9 rocket. It can go on either one. And then it deorbits about Mach 25, which would happen with anything in low Earth orbit, about 17,000 miles an hour. And it can glide to land on a runway. So again, very much like a space shuttle. It's called a space plane. And as I said, it started by NASA in 1999. It's been military and classified since 2004. It's now run by Space Force. So what is it? It's classified, but they do say publicly what it, in general, it's supposed to be doing. And that's demonstrating technologies for reliable, reusable, uncrewed spacecraft, basically. And they're focused, two major focuses, reusability and operating experiments, which they can then return to Earth. And they never tell you what's in those experiments, but I'm sure they're interesting. But now we're talking about space planes. That raises some of the things the Chinese have been doing recently. Because because they have something that might be a space plane or it might be a hypersonic missile. And that this all happened. What happened was, of all the places, a story was broken about Chinese missile to the London Financial Times. So go figure. It was obviously a leak from somebody. Somebody wanted this out. But anyway, they've actually launched this thing, which most people in the U.S. or the military anyway think is a hypersonic missile. Hypersonic meaning travels at least 5 times the speed of sound, probably more, and probably nuclear capable. China denies that. They say they're testing a reusable space vehicle. And both of those things can actually be true. It's possible. But in any case, it does indicate the Chinese program is a lot more advanced than we thought. So there's a lot of panic going on kind of right now. But the reality is that panic has been ongoing for the last couple of years, as you'll see as I talk a little more. So who's working on hypersonic weapons? Well, China, the US, and Russia, they've long been players. And then there are people working with them. So for instance, strangely enough, India is working with Russia on theirs. The Australia and some others are working with the US. So there's a lot of joint work going on, but the lead is basically China, the US, and Russia. North Korea might be working on something separately. A general who was the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, retiring, he says that we're falling behind, basically that we have a risk-averse culture at this point. And he's pointing out that we've done maybe in the last 5 years, maybe tested 9 times. Whereas China literally has done hundreds of experiments. So they're coming along very, very rapidly. So a little more details on this particular one. The rocket would be launched and it flies through a very low Earth orbit, like 150 kilometers, which is quite low. In this particular test, they apparently circled the whole globe. But the idea is this, for a weapon, it's what actually they call, or is often called, a fractional orbital bombardment system, or FROB. They always love acronyms in space. The fractional orbital means that typically it goes through not a complete orbit. What happens is the thing goes up on a rocket, you get to a very low Earth orbit, and then at some point you do a burn, to release a glider. And then the glider comes down fast to hit the target. In this case, it is 5 times the speed of sound. So it's much slower than a ballistic missile. So the way you compare these things, if you were doing a ballistic missile, it would go up, like 1,200 kilometers up as opposed to 150. And it's in just a fixed trajectory. And basically you burn up your fuel to get up there and it just kind of coasts down. And as a result, you can defend against them more easily. You can see where they're going. The path is predictable. And they're not moving all that fast. Well, they're moving fast, but they're predictable, and you had time to see them. If you're doing a hypersonic glide vehicle, you go up in a very, very low orbit, 150 kilometers, and you can come around like from the side or even around the South Pole, and that's what actually is worrying, some of the military people right now, especially. They're maneuverable. They actually have control surfaces on them. It's not just like a ballistic missile where, again, it's totally predictable. You can choose you can go up or down, you can go left or right. So that makes it very hard to track and very hard to shoot at. So moving on, the whole hypersonic glider thing is not really a new idea. It's really been around since the 60s. When you think about it, anything coming back out of low Earth orbit is hypersonic. It's going 17,000 miles an hour. So the space shuttle would be an example of a controllable hypersonic glider. It was, just like any other space plane. But the difference between that and a weapon, when you think about them, space planes are a lot less aerodynamic. That's why you see that they're kind of, rounded and big and bulky looking like the space shuttle. And the reason for that is you're trying to slow down. You want to slow down so you can come to a normal landing. Well, you don't have to land with a weapon. You actually want that to be very, very aerodynamic. So they tend to be very, very small, thin wedge-like shapes. They can keep going fast. The obvious advantages of that are they're harder to shoot, harder to shoot down, and they go a lot faster. When they hit, they do a lot more damage. You don't want the thing going slow. You want it going as fast as possible. You do more damage that way. So, and of course, you don't have an explosive payload if you're doing a shuttle. So those are the differences. But people are even worried about that X-37B space plane. They're saying, that could carry weapons, and yeah, it's true. But this is a more efficient way to do it. But I would point out, China has actually fielded these weapons before. Intermediate range ballistic missiles, they have them. Since 2019, they've been deploying them. Conventional warhead for sure. They deny that they're nuclear, but most of the military seems to think they are. Intermediate range means 1,100 to 1,600 mile kind of a range. There's basically no defense against these. You cannot stop them. I don't even think the Aegis systems on that are on our Navy ships would be able to react fast enough to hit these things. So might as well go right into other issues about preparing for space war. It's sort of coming in a way. It's a lot like cyber war in a lot of ways. It's kind of stuff that will go on in the background. Most people won't even be aware of it. And it'll probably be kept secret and can be kept secret, but everybody's preparing for it, and it has been for a while. For example, the Chinese, they launched a classified military satellite in this last month. And when they call it the test space debris mitigation. Now, we've talked about that, and we all know that space debris is a huge problem. It is a huge problem. But the problem is it's dual use. You could be declared to be the space junk. And if you were taken down, you might not appreciate it if you're a live satellite owner. So, because think about what has to happen. You have to approach a satellite or debris, an object of some sort. You have to approach it, you have to capture it or disable it, or maybe move it. I mean, you do this kind of things. That's what you have to do to get rid of undesirable space junk. It's also what you have to do to get rid of enemy spacecraft or just satellites you don't like. In this particular launch, the Chinese didn't provide any details at all. They did go up at high to 22,000 mile geosynchronous orbit kind of a thing, which is really where the large high value targets really are. The really big satellites for reconnaissance or for communications are up there. This matters a lot to the US. Actually, a lot of military depend on space, but the US probably is the most dependent on it. Communications, I mean, it's an essential part of your worldwide military. You care about that. But also GPS. All of our weapons pretty much depend on GPS working. If that were taken out, most of our stuff wouldn't work at all. And that even things like smart bombs, the kind of bombs where we dropped them in Iraq, where you had regular bombs and they outfitted them with a little kit that would put pins on them, and those are controlled through GPS. All of our missiles, all of our drones, all that stuff depends on GPS working and on communications. What is space used for? You identify targets, like you identify new missile bases, for instance, or you track moving targets like ships and submarines or troops and planes. All those things are done from space right now. Detecting missile launches, if you are worried about a launch of nuclear missiles, we watch for that very carefully, obviously, with a whole network of satellites, and that, as does Russia and now China. You can calculate trajectories for anti-missile defense. And more generally, just intelligence on economic conditions. What is your military capability? What kind of industries are you building? Is your agriculture failing or succeeding? All those kind of things can be told from space. So we depend very heavily on that, and the other countries are coming along as well. So there's been a lot of experimentation over time, and you might call brute force ways of eliminating satellites. They're called kinetic weapons if you if you crash into them. You might crash into them or you might explode. They've definitely been tested by the US, China, and Russia. I mean, there's been lots of documented cases of that kind of thing. Usually what happens is somebody destroys one of their own satellites so that nobody else will complain. Although that has caused a lot of problems with debris. Both Russia and China has caused that problem. And people have complained about that for a while. Those weapons can be launched from the ground, could be launched from a ship, planes, or satellites. So all those kind of things are possible. One of the most recent Russian tests was actually from a satellite. The problem with that is that you get a lot of debris, and that affects everybody. And then, as I was saying, there's still a lot of complaints about the recent Russian and Chinese tests. We always worry about the Kessler cascade, where one satellite blows up for whatever reason, those fragments destroy other satellites, they blow up, and you just get a mess and nobody can fly anywhere. That's somewhat of a concern.
And this will become more of a concern when people like SpaceX and OneWeb and the other 99 different companies that are putting up satellites, communication satellites, the little ones. Now they're going from dozens of satellites to hundreds of satellites to one company just filed last week for an application for 3,400 satellites in one of their satellite constellations. And this wasn't even one of the larger companies.
Yeah.
So if all it takes is the first one or two start to get blown up, and then it's going to turn into, it's like watching a chain reaction explosion on the 610 loop at rush hour. It's going to be real bad.
Yeah. Well, the good thing is at least at low Earth orbits, the orbits decay pretty quickly, so at least most of that debris goes away. The problem is the higher orbits, especially, those things could be in orbit for hundreds of thousands of years. So the problem gets worse the higher up you go.
And if that cascade starts, it's going to make it very difficult for anyone else to transit through that zone safely. We're talking hundreds of miles of altitude that's just going to be like being in one of those galleries at a carnival with bullets going off every which direction. Well, they made a movie.
I think, more than one probably. Yeah. So anyway, those are the reasons why these are not in favor. The thing is, the reality is, at least all the major players here have these weapons, but they're very unlikely to actually use them. It's there for deterrence in the ultimate kind of a case. But the problem is that you kill your own assets as well as the enemies. And the same thing goes for an EMP, a large electromagnetic pulse, which you can get by exploding a nuclear weapon, taking out, basically frying the electronics and anything in the area. The same problem, it doesn't distinguish between your stuff and the enemy stuff. So again, not that likely, but they're available, in the ultimate case. The only people that might use such a thing might be a really minor player, like in North Korea. They don't have much to lose. They don't have assets up there, not much to speak of. Okay, so along these lines, Pentagon officially has declared space as a war-fighting domain. So, you have land, sea, air, and now you have space as officially one. That just sort of makes it official. I mean, it didn't, the reality is it has been for a while, but it's just interest is picking up. But given that you don't really just want to have a mass of debris everywhere, what do? Well, the emphasis now is on how do you disable satellites and leaving them in place. In fact, ideally with deniability, if people can't even tell who did it or even not even notice it right away, that's kind of the goal right now. That's what they want to do. And again, that's the analogy there is cyber war, same kind of thing. A lot of stuff could go on and you can't quite identify who did it. That even though you may know in principle who did it, if you can't prove it, it makes it hard to retaliate. So for instance, the Chinese in 2016, they showed that they can approach and capture a satellite in geosynchronous orbit. It actually had a robot arm that could grab it, destroy the solar cells, or destroying it one way or another. The Chinese press themselves had put out a story recently about their current technology they're working on is grabbing a satellite and basically inserting a small explosive up inside the thruster, and just have a very small explosion inside, which would disable the satellite, but it would not leave debris or anything. The interesting thing is that particular story, that's from the South China Morning Post, which is it used to be a very independent newspaper out of Hong Kong. Right, it got bought up by Alibaba, and it's essentially at this point considered to be a mouthpiece of the Chinese government. So they're not being secretive about what they're developing. Now, some of that could be trying to intimidate, but it's probably pretty realistic. And I say that because actually Northrop Grumman has done essentially the same thing. We've reported that actually, mission extension vehicle satellites. They had two satellites that went up. What they did was they grabbed an Intelsat satellite that was out of fuel and was not really able to be used because they couldn't maintain the exact orbits. But now they're maintaining the orbit for them. But what that says is they demonstrated exactly the same capability. They went in, they grabbed the thruster by sticking a spear into it or something. That's how they stuck themselves to it. And then they moved it. Now they know they're maintaining the adjustment, but they proved that they can easily do this. So I say the Chinese claim is not that unreasonable because we in fact have the same exact capability, except we've only used it for good so far. We've actually helped out Intelsat. Other examples for offense that don't necessarily destroy and result in a lot of debris, we'll be using lasers to either temporarily blind or maybe even just disable a satellite. And that again could be from the ground to see the air, maybe even other satellites. It does take a lot of power, so maybe it's not as easy to do on a satellite. L3 Harris, one of our contractors, they just got a contract for jamming, which is another way you can do offense. So that's that kind. We know that kind of stuff is ongoing because it's announced publicly. It's not really a secret. The other offensive kind of thing you can do is cyber attacks just directly. That you've seen in numerous movies, of course. So the problem that you're faced either if you work in the State Department or the military is how do you respond to these kind of things? Say a laser blinds one of your satellites, or suppose there's even a satellite that's tailgating one of your sensitive ones. We have these $billion reconnaissance satellites set up by the National Reconnaissance Office. What happens when a Chinese or a Russian satellite just kind of tags along, a couple hundred feet away from it? That could be perceived as a very hostile act because they're basically threatening that they could take it out anytime. What do you do? It's not an easy question. Those are the kind of things that people are grappling with right now.
Great.
Yeah.
I have run across references in the literature to satellites getting blinded, and one reference said apparently it's happening on a rather regular basis over one country in particular, and that the U.S. military is getting pretty cheesed off about, but they won't name the country. And I was wondering if you had any
I don't know
about the specific countries.
But that's what I mean about the why it kind of goes on in secret. You probably will never really know because they might not want to publicize it. Maybe you don't want to realize that you're as vulnerable as you are. There's so many imponderables there. But the fact is the capabilities are there. And the only question is who's building those capabilities, who's likely to use them, what are we going to do about it? And those are very serious ongoing questions.
Do about it without escalating to a much higher level.
And ultimately, it comes down to deterrence when you get down to it. We've had nuclear weapons since the 40s. We haven't really used them since then because people stopped short of taking the next really big step. But here, there's a lot of smaller steps you can take. There's a lot of satellites up there, and is taking out one satellite, is that bad? It's not like that's not like bombing Washington or Beijing. It's a much smaller thing. Okay, so defensive strategies. So this is where most of the other activity would be going on. And a good example would be that in this last month, the French military launched a military satellite. And that one was very explicitly designed to be ready for space warfare. Even down to the point of having multiple cameras just to identify and monitor attackers, meaning other satellites that might be getting a little close. They want to be sure they have documented evidence of who's coming in, so at least they can tell what happened. They are stated to have very, very extreme anti-jamming capabilities, and that's presumably classified. You don't know what that means, but they've definitely said they addressed that. And the same thing goes from electromagnetic pulse resistance. They claim that they could actually withstand even nuclear blast from some distance anyway. But the other thing is that they have more capability for moving, because one thing you can do if you're being tailgated by another satellite, you can move. Now, of course, that satellite probably can too, but if you have better capabilities for moving, you can get out of range and maybe be safer. But this is the kind of stuff that's going on. That's just built into their satellite. Another thing you can do, I'm calling it here the school of fish strategy, but basically there is a shift going on. Instead of having a few large, huge, expensive satellites in geosynchronous orbit, have a whole lot more low Earth orbit satellites. Very much like the difference between the few Intelsat communication satellites that are way up there versus Starlink, where you have 1,700 and in the future 42,000 satellites, all in very low Earth orbit. There's a whole bunch of benefits to that. The large geosatellites would also be called juicy targets. That I've seen that actually referenced literally as that. The low Earth orbits, they're smaller, they're easier to launch and replace, and there's just too many to easily destroy. You could spend a lot of effort to take out $1 billion satellite. You wouldn't spend that same amount of effort, on a $100,000 satellite. So there's definitely a shift to that. And related to that is just more backup kind of redundancy. And the US has ongoing programs on this, and I'm sure the other countries do too. But the Air Force is definitely looking into replacing GPS and intelligence gathering in constellations of a whole lot more small satellites. There's a lot of active programs going on for that. And actually, they're looking at even existing commercial satellites like Starlink. They have asked Starlink to have some of these capabilities as well. So this picture here is just kind of a reminder that there are satellites that are way, way out there in the high orbits, the geosynchronous orbits. But really, what you want to be in that school of fish down in there, in this area.
So it used to be that commercial satellites would be small and they would piggyback on large military payloads going up in space. Now, according
Yeah.
to the reading out of the Air Force, it's the other way around.
Yeah.
SpaceX and Starlink, they're setting up lots of commercial satellites, and now the military is piggybacking little payloads, little satellites on the back of the
Yeah.
commercial.
And they're doing some of their own too. I think they're doing some in the, the 140 kind of satellite range, having some of their own constellations as well. So both of those things are going on. But yeah, it is kind of funny. It used to be the military drove a lot of this stuff, and now actually the commercial world is driving most of the satellites that are up there. A large number of them are commercial. So that brings us to this question we have of how many launches do you think we've had in the last month, basically since the last meeting? And I will highlight that this does not include the Chinese hypersonic missile. That was only a fractional orbit, so we don't count that as really trying for orbit.
Mr. Stanley, I have a comment.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, hi, how you doing? Yeah, this is Vito. I know this is not exactly on the topic, a little bit off it, but I was thinking if extraterrestrials do exist, I think our space war activities would be a major deterrent to their desire to contact us. Would you agree?
Well, the question was, I don't know if you can hear that out there. The question was, will this be useful in deterring aliens? I guess, yeah, it has to help. I mean, presumably if they were able to get here, their technology is probably so much more advanced that we're not likely to really offer serious resistance. But
actually, I meant the converse too. I mean, if they wanted to peacefully get in touch with us, this would definitely be a deterrent. And of course, this is just using my imagination.
Yeah. Well, all that is speculative. This is really the realm of speculative fiction. This is why we have science fiction to help us figure out how to answer these questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, unanswerable.
That's right. I appreciate it.
Okay. Anyway, this particular picture that is shown in the background here, this is the Chinese rocket that's launching their launched their three astronauts up to their space station. Okay, so how many people think that there have been more than 8 launches? How about
Everybody online thinks it's one. They got 10, 12, 13, 14.
12.
Okay, well, anyway, the answer is 12. I'll just jump right ahead to the answer here.
Got a breakdown on those?
Oh, I think I have to do something with this thing. Yeah, I'll show the picture. I guess somehow or other, there's a little window showing me how the online poll went. It popped up, and it seems like it interferes with anything else. All right, let's see if I can.
You might have to like back and forth in the house.
Here, I'll just use the mouse here. Okay. Anyway, launches since last meeting. It turns out we've already talked about quite a few of these anyway. I will highlight a couple of things. One is South Korea is now an entrant. This was their first, they failed. It was a failure. They didn't quite make it. Actually, it was only the 3rd stage that failed in this rocket. So they were pretty darn close. That is their first, using our own home-built technology. I think they've been involved in space launches before, but not with all their own technology. I will point out also that out of those 12 launches, only one of them was American. Kind of interesting. And I thought at first, well, maybe that's because of liquid oxygen shortage that we mentioned last year, but it turns out almost all these other ships also use liquid oxygen as their oxidizer. One exception being the Quasar Chinese one. That's actually a solid rocket fuel, but most of them are using liquid oxygen, so that wasn't it. And of course, they mentioned the really big ones like the Lucy spacecraft that went up on an Atlas V. Okay, I guess that's about it.
SpaceX? Goodness.
No, that's they're well, it seemed like they're taking a pause in all those space or Starlink launches. So yeah, I don't know why there's a few. Well, some of that's just luck. I mean, they're supposed to actually send up a crew to the space station, and that's been delayed several times. But those kind of delays happen all the time. And what we report here is when they actually go. If you look at the history of almost any launch, almost all of them have been delayed 2 or 3 times, typically due to weather, sometimes due to some minor glitch they uncovered during the countdown. So.
I know there are issues reported in Aviation Week to various missions being launched, and it has to do with if there's a delay, then they get bumped because the Air Force has some other higher priority mission.
Yeah.
But it looks like it's not so high priority that they needed to do it within basically the month of October.
Yeah, And all these are from different places. I mean,
Yeah,
you know,
I'm a little surprised that nothing went out of either the East Coast range or the West Coast range
Yeah.
by the Air Force during this whole period of time.
yeah. But the thing you're mentioning is that things get backed up when there's a delay. That, for instance, actually hurt SLS. There should have been and Starliner, both Boeing efforts. Both of those have been held up at times because of one thing or another. But then the launch pads weren't, things weren't even available. So yeah.
Greg, I have another question.
There was already one. I'll come back to you. There was a question coming from the audience.
What is the average
Yeah.
life of a satellite? Because, I mean, it's so many and there's.
Yeah. Well, the older, the ones that are way in high orbit, which are very expensive, they tend to have been up there for 10, 20 years sometimes.
And that's one of the reasons why they're so expensive, is because they're built to last.
Yeah.
that
Well,
long.
and they're heavy, and then there's a lot of high orbit, so it takes a lot more, energy to get them there. Now, the low Earth orbit ones, they're actually kind of designed. I mean, they make, in the case of Starlink, for instance, they highlight that as a benefit, that they only last maybe 7 to 10 years. And that's on purpose. They say, well, the technology will be obsolete in 7 years anyway. We want them to come down because we want to replace them. And it's so much cheaper to replace them now that we don't care so much. So the whole philosophy has changed a lot on that.
And how many of them they can recover? Because some of them, they are not working, they are still around orbiting.
Oh, yeah,
They
Yes.
recover them.
there's a lot. Yeah, the question was, what happens to the old satellites? They're actually, it might even be under treaty, but certainly for those big satellites, what they're supposed to do is near the end of their life, they're supposed to relocate themselves. So the ones way up in high orbit, they actually go up to a higher orbit. There's kind of a ghost graveyard up there with thousands of satellites. The ones that are in low Earth orbit, they're supposed to deorbit, come down and burn up in the atmosphere. And as long as they're under control, they can do that. The problem, of course, is some of the failures mean they're not controllable anymore. Either you can't communicate with them, or they ran out of fuel early, or whatever happened. So that doesn't always work. But of all those objects I showed in that one slide, that one slide back there,
Clouds.
yeah, 95% of those dots are not satellites, functioning satellites. Now that also just includes actual debris. About 5% of those are satellites. The rest of them are debris or dead satellites. And there's stuff floating around up there. Typically, the upper stages, for the most part, a lot of them are still, you blast something up there, and the very last stage might be relatively small. It might be there just mainly to adjust the orbit, called a tick stage, just to adjust the final orbit of these things. And they're still up there. Nobody ever takes those down. So in fact, well, even that Chinese launch that I just mentioned, the one that went up, in geosynchronous orbit, assumed to be demonstrating anti-satellite stuff, it split into two. There was only one. Now it just split into two. They announced that a couple of days ago. Well, that was probably the kick stage, and that's probably what they're going to practice, attacking. So they're up right next to each other. They practice maneuvering around it. They practice spoofing, trying to make moves right when you're a day-night boundary or something. They do this kind of stuff. So, but anyway, there's a lot of dead satellites up there is the answer. And yeah.
Up until about 5 years ago, there was probably about maybe 4,000 satellites, dead satellites up there. But since SpaceX come along and with the notion of satellite constellations with many thousands of satellites involved, that number is going up almost daily. Certainly with SpaceX, every launch they put up 60 or 120 more satellites, and they've been doing that for the last 3 years.
Yeah. Well, luckily they're able.
There are like 5 other companies that are right behind them doing the same thing. So that number of 4,000 dead satellites is going to get much larger very fast in the next 2 years.
Now, the good thing about the SpaceX ones is that they build it into their plans to deorbit when they're near the end of their life. And again, as long as they're under control, they can do that. And they have deorbited quite a few of them already. And deorbiting does mean one way or another forcing them down to the atmosphere to burn up. And that's what.
That interfere with, let's say, the shuttles to the moon or going to Mars. I mean, that won't interfere too large. I mean, going to space and crash.
It's a problem. I mean, these satellites are all tracked. I mean, there are, the US and probably other people, but definitely the US tries to track. There's even independent organizations that track satellites as best they can. So the good thing is space is really big, as they say. So, it sounds like a lot, but still ultimately the odds aren't that high of just accidentally running into something. It has happened. It has happened.
6:10 loop at midnight on a Wednesday night, it's not too bad, but if you come back 12 hours later, it's a different story entirely.
Yeah. Okay. We did have an online question still.
I do. Yeah, Greg, this is a more practical question. Is the Atlas V project related to or operating in conjunction with government and private projects that want to produce space tugs to divert near-Earth asteroids, thus avoiding future collisions?
Well, okay, are there two separate questions? The questions there were about Atlas V and about avoiding asteroid collisions. The Atlas V part of that question, they're not making those anymore. They have they've announced they're finally going to stop making them. So maybe there's still 30 of those left, and they're gradually using them up. There are projects like this DART launch coming up pretty soon, which are aimed at figuring out how to deflect asteroids. I'm not really sure if that answered your question.
It did actually. Thank you.
Oh, okay. All right, I think we're pretty much at the end here. Yeah, well, I guess we've already done discussion and questions. So. All right, next speaker, Nathan Price. Now, you may know him. He is the president of our chapter. In fact, he's the founder of the chapter. He has a lifelong passion for space exploration and development. He's been involved in a variety of space-related things. One of the interesting one is the Countdown to the Moon program, where every day he interviews someone about, and he's going to ask them questions about, well, when did you hear about the moon landing and that sort of thing. We would love to have you sign up. The web link is there, countdowntothemoon.org. He also volunteers at the Space Center Houston. And of course, he founded this chapter and started meetings in January 2018. He's really the one guy who's responsible for us being here. He puts in the most work and has really made it successful. So we appreciate him. As for what he does in his other lives, he works for a software company called Anaplan. He previously was in HP. He is a development lead. He has a BS in mathematics and a minor in economics at the University of Houston. So his topic is going interstellar. And what that is what he learned there's a conference called Interstellar, and this is the 7th Interstellar Symposium. They run them every couple of years. And they talk about more of the really long range kind of things, literally interstellar travel and that sort of thing. So pretty interesting stuff. Time to take it over. And I'm sorry if I ran over things.
Let me just get switched out real quick. Oh, the R used to be on the right line before, so I'm not sure what happened there. Interstellar. Well, we already talked about me, but the Interstellar Symposium is put together every other year by the Interstellar Research Group, and this is the 7th time that they had it. And the first one was in 2011, which was in Tennessee. And in fact, the name of the group was originally the Tennessee Research Group. So once they kind of broadened their horizons, they had to change it to the Interstellar Research Group. But they've had it every couple of years. And this year it was in Tucson. So I flew from Houston to Tucson. And I started my journey at the IAH Terminal A, and we have the Astro Texan cow. Have a little model here in case you wanted to see it. I always get my picture taken in front of that whenever I'm going. But have you all been to Terminal A and seen the? It's definitely worth going just to see that, and you don't have to go through security to get to it, so you can actually just go and see it. And then of course I arrived at Tucson. One thing I learned is Arizona has its own time zone. They do not participate in daylight savings time, so that I thought that was kind of interesting. If you look in a list of time zones, they have Yeah, they never change. They have Eastern, Central, Mountain, Arizona, and Pacific. So, it looks very different in Arizona. There are cacti and mountains and lots of things that you don't normally see here. And that's a tarantula. It's about the size of my fist. And it's just sitting there on the path, you know, don't bother it, it won't bother you. And then, of course, the houses and everything look different than they do here. And they have a coffee shop there with a really good sense of humor. So if you're stressed, the answer is coffee. If you're anxious, the answer is coffee. If you're happy, coffee. And then, you know, a day without coffee is like, just kidding, I have no idea. So I thought that was pretty cool. University of Arizona helped sponsor the conference this time. And they have a lot of space-related buildings at the University of Arizona. And I went through the halls and took some pictures of the various things that, you know, you could see. And there's just so much history there in terms of their participation in the space program and various activities. This was an interesting sign. It says, this room is supplied with nitrogen. If there is a leak, the air inside could lack enough oxygen inside to support life. 2 breaths of 100% nitrogen can cause immediate unconsciousness with no warning. So I wonder what's really in that room. Anyway, so just some other pictures that I took as I was walking around. And who should I happen to see? I saw Amelia there. She was our speaker virtually a few months back. And I was like, are you Amelia? She's like, yes. Are you from the University of Texas in El Paso? She's like, yes. I'm like, do you study in situ resource extraction using ablative arc mining? And she's like, yes. I'm like, I'm Nathan. Oh, she's like, oh, okay. So apparently, so it was good to see her. And we had lots of talks. One of the people was a geologist studying like planetary, you know, volcanoes and things like that. He was in sabbatical in Iceland when a volcano started erupting. So that was like really, really wonderful for him.
Is grade dependent on being able to pronounce the name of the?
Well, he's actually Icelandic, so for him it's easy. If it does depend on it, then he's got that one sorted. I said towards the front, so it looks like very few people. There were about 120 people there, and we had a couple of lunchtime talks, and the agenda was really jammed packed. We had over 30 presenters, some of which were supposed to be there because NASA's you know, NIAC conference was supposed to be at the University of Arizona the previous week. And a lot of presenters were supposed to be flying there paid by NASA. But whenever they went virtual, of course, they didn't pay for the travel anymore. So half the speakers were also virtual and they kind of alternated. They did a really fantastic job and they kept people on time. We finished every day at the right time. It was quite an effort. Instead of going over kind of all the talks, I thought it'd be good to kind of focus on one of them, just to give you some of the concepts and interesting things that I learned, and then kind of just talk briefly about just a couple more and kind of put them in a logical sequence. So we'll see how well I did with that. So the search for nearby habitable worlds by Daniel Apai. He's a professor at the University of Arizona, and he basically had a set of questions that he's working through. So these are actually his slides that he presented. I just took some of them to kind of show you, but the one that I wanted to focus on is that first one. How can we find exosolar planets? You know, we've talked about actually finding planets, you know, around other stars. What is that really like? Well, the challenge is planets do not emit their own light. They reflect their own, the star's light that they orbit. And so they're very faint objects. So how faint? About as faint as a firefly compared to, you know, the light tower. I mean, just try imagining what it would take to be able to see that firefly next to that light. So that's the challenge we have. And there's basically 3 different ways so far we have of detecting exoplanets. We have the direct imaging approach, which is trying to see that firefly. We have transits, which I'll talk about a little bit. And then radio velocity is the 3rd method. So you may remember this picture from me walking around the facilities. This is actually a picture of a extrasolar, you know, planetary system. And this is what it looks like over time. Now, in order to take a picture like this, you need for the plane of the system to be perpendicular to your view. You need a very bright star. You need big planets that are far away from that bright star. And so what you do is you cover up the bright star in your telescope, and you got really sensitive equipment, and hopefully you're getting enough light off of these planets to be able to see them. So really extraordinary. I believe this is the only planetary system that we've actually been able to do this with. So finding that combination of, you know, characteristics, orientation, size, and these are so big and so massive that, you know, nobody could live on them, and they're so far away from their sun that they're not in the habitable zone. So I definitely see 4. You know, you could kind of make out this one, this one, this one, this one, and you know, it's really kind of difficult. You know, the stars are not perfectly round objects. You know, whenever you're in elementary school, you draw that little circle and you're done with the sun. But in reality, they're very dynamic objects that are changing. The transit method has been very successful, but for this to work, you need to have the exact opposite orientation with the planetary system. You need, exactly, edge on. You have to have the planet come across your view of the sun, and you're looking for this little bitty dip in the brightness of the light. This looks like a big dip, but it's very, 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 very small. Essentially, back to that, you know, big light, it'd be like the firefly flying in front of the big light, you know, kind of measuring that. And the atmosphere, you know, produces enough variation that actually doing this through the atmosphere is challenging. But if you're above the atmosphere, not so difficult. So the Kepler Space Telescope has been observing this little patch of sky for many, many years, just measuring the brightness of each of those stars. And then, you know, they figure out when it's dimming and when it's getting brighter. And from that, they could figure out how many planets are there, how close are they to the star, how big are they, and that type of thing. And the yellow here represents all the different planets that were detected at the time. By 2017, there's actually more now. I should have gotten a more recent one. But at this time, there is like 2,500 planets found from Kepler. And I think that's like several times more than that. The blue is through other efforts. So that was so successful. And that was such a little tiny patch of sky with like millions and millions of stars. So the next mission is called TESS. And this satellite actually is spinning to actually measure all the stars. So it's, we should be getting a lot of data from this. The next way that we have of seeing exoplanets is actually through this radio velocity. And to kind of explain that, we were all taught whenever we were little that the Earth orbits the sun. And actually, we've learned that's not true. And that actually turns out to be a really good thing, because the Earth and the sun orbit the center of mass of the system. So if you have like this very simple planetary system where you have one sun and one planet, you're actually going to see the star move as the planet orbits it. you know, and essentially they're pulling away from each other. This wobble is really difficult to detect. In fact, you can't detect the wobble by looking at the star going back and forth. But if you're looking at it this way, the star is not only going back and forth, it's also going back. It's not only going side to side, it's actually going back and forth also toward you and away from you, which is a really good thing because, you know, if you look at how that star is moving, you know, it's moving away, it's moving back, it's moving away, and it's moving back. And we can see the spectral lines of that star. And as it moves away from you, those spectral lines get red shifted. And as it moves towards you, those spectral lines get blue shifted. And so, you know, this is how we can also detect stars. But what we really need is better eyes. You want to see more, you need better eyes. And does anybody know what's happening next month?
The launch of the James Webb Telescope. Yeah.
Exactly. Finally, after decades and decades.
32 years.
I hope it all works out. But yes, the James Webb is launching next month. And this telescope cost over $10 billion. So that's one bit of fancy equipment that I really hope takes some good pictures. Well, anyway, Dr. Apai has an idea. Instead of building these huge multi-decade, you know, huge one-off satellites over decades that take billions of dollars, you know, that have somewhat of a limited, you know, mirror size, he proposes this project called Nautilus that would actually be over twice the size of the James Webb telescope in terms of the amount of light it could collect. But instead of one huge gigantic telescope, actually build it as a set of smaller telescopes that are all identical to each other that can be flown in formation and launched on maybe something like the Starship. So this could be potentially a lot cheaper to do because you pay that development cost one time, but you get a whole bunch of telescopes out of it, as opposed to paying that development cost and getting one telescope out of it. And then with the Starship, you could launch maybe a few dozens of these at a time and really create a huge arrays of optical telescopes working in conjunction with each other. So really a neat thing. I definitely recommend checking out Dr. Apai's website, apai.space. It's his personal blog. And then I had a few other topics that I'd like to breeze through. So gravitational lensing, have anybody heard of this? Yeah? Okay. Well, if you use you know, your regular lens and actually bends the light to a focal point, and the sun actually bends light around it to a focal point as well, that focal point happens to be 50 times from the sun as the Earth is from the sun. So it's 50 astronomical units out. There was a presentation talking about a nuclear fusion drive that could actually send a craft to that point in just a couple of years. And Alan Stern, who was the scientist for the New Horizons mission that sent the New Horizons probe out to Pluto, pointed out that, you know, it took 3 days for the astronauts to go from the Earth to the moon. And New Horizons is actually the fastest spacecraft ever launched. Anybody want to guess how long it took for New Horizons to go from the distance as the Earth to the moon? 8 hours. 8 hours. So that's how fast it's going. And it still took 10 years to get to Pluto. So you have to go really fast to get out there. And 50 AU is well past Pluto, by the way. There's also another project. Have you all heard of Breakthrough Starshot? Yeah, anybody else? So the idea here is to, over the next 30 years, develop the technology that would allow for you to send an object to Alpha Centauri within 20 years. So basically traveling at 20% the speed of light. Their current plan is to create a 1 gram probe that has a camera on it, solar cell, radio, that can take a picture. You know, it's probably going to be a blurry picture as it goes through the Alpha Centauri system, of the Alpha Centauri system, send it back to Earth, and they're going to accelerate it using a solar cell that's going to be propelled with a whole bunch of high-power ground-based lasers. And they think they can figure all this out within the next 30 years, and then 20 years after that, actually have it arrive in Alpha Centauri. And it's being funded by a billionaire who's actually already paid the money for it. So it's really happening.
Where did they get the power to transmit that?
Yeah, it's apparently, you know, that they're thinking solar powered from the star that they arrive at. So clearly there's a lot of
Really efficient battery.
there's a lot of technology that needs to be you know, worked out. So, but in 30 years, you know, we've gone from you know, flip phones that can barely make a phone call to this, which, you know, you get maps and everything on. So it should be kind of interesting. One thing I should point out is it's going to the nearest star system, which is Alpha Centauri, but the stars are actually all orbiting around the galactic center, and we're coming closer and further away from stars in our local area. So over thousands of years and tens of thousands of years and millions of years, our closest star actually changes. And this is kind of more of a 3D view of what some of those closest approaches look like over the next, you know, 60,000. Well, there's even one that's 1.36 million years there that's even supposed to be within inside of the Oort cloud. So that's really close. We probably want to make sure we've mastered space by 1.36 million years, because that's probably going to have a lot of comets. Well, we're thinking about sending probes to other star systems. The next logical thought is if there are, you know, intelligences out there, maybe they've thought about sending stuff out too. And this professor, Avi Loeb, that's what he proposes, is that we need to be looking out for techno signatures, you know, things coming through our solar system. And you know, he says that if there is life in the rest of the universe, it's very possible it's older and more sophisticated and more developed than we are. In fact, he says we're probably not the sharpest cookie in the cookie jar. So, and there was an object that came through our solar system sometime back called Oumuamua. I don't. Oumuamua. Yeah, that's it. Oumuamua. It's Hawaiian. It came at a very sharp angle, you know, perpendicular to the plane of the system. Was going so fast it got kind of looped around the sun and got kicked back out off to someplace. There's some thoughts that maybe there was some evidence that it didn't behave like a normal object, and you know, there's some thoughts that could it have been maybe artificial. And even if it wasn't, it's still an interesting object to look at. I mean, this is something that's actually come from outside of our solar system. So we should be ready to investigate these things, even if they are just natural phenomenon. Be interesting to see stuff coming from other parts of the system. But if it was from another civilization, would we actually see it as technology? I mean, this is not such a good screenshot, but can you imagine giving a cell phone to our ancestors like 5,000 years ago? To them, it might just look like a never before seen, you know, stone or rock that they hadn't seen before. So he proposes that we really need to have some cosmic modesty because there's actually more habitable Earth-like worlds in the universe than there are grains of sand on all the beaches. So that's kind of neat. Well, my goal was to actually get y'all kind of excited about the next conference. So I'm not sure if I did that, but the next conference is going to be in 2023 at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And you know, the exact time and details is still being worked out, but you can keep an eye on the Interstellar Research Group, irg.space website. So any interest in going to Canada in 2023?
Will they be presenting in French or English? That's okay, probably.
Yeah, I think English, but maybe they'll have a real-time translator. I don't know. That's a good point. All the other conferences have been in English, but you know. Well,
The French Canadians like to speak French between them, but English.
Oh, to outsiders. Well, that's pretty much all I had. Any questions, feedbacks, thoughts?
Yes. Is there a publication of the all the presentations, like papers or whatever that were given, that would be available to those of us that I can buy somewhere, available on the internet?
I don't think I mean, I think on their website, they have a little overview of the presentation. I emailed a couple of speakers and asked for their slides, and they emailed it to me. Every presentation and poster, I think, got written up and put into a paper that's in a journal. I looked at the price of the journal, and I think they only have library versions of it, which are quite pricey. But they did do the entire presentation on Zoom, so I'm not sure if it's possible to see a recording, though. That might be another option.
Yeah, I mean, because at ISDC, you can buy, for a small fee, you can buy discs of individual presentations. And something like that would be real nice.
Yeah. I think it might be available on their website a little bit, but I'm not sure. That's good. Any other questions?
About the oyster, the materials that went beyond the solar boundaries.
Right.
Do we have still communication with the?
My understanding is we do. We're still communicating with it, and
How long is it taking now to get
I-
any response?
I don't know. I think it's definitely. I think it's like days to talk to a Voyager 2. I think it's a day or so.
Like communication with the satellites?
Exactly. Yeah. So I think because the Mars is like 20 minutes, and it's like way further than Mars. So I think it is a day or two.
On top of that, the communicator is the same technology that the more than 25 years ago.
Yes, I mean, it is amazing it's working, right? Because it was launched in what, 1976? So it's like 44 years old, 45 years old.
It has an atomic power supply. That's really interesting.
And the signal has to be so weak. I think I read somewhere that it's like something like 1/1 millionth of a watt.
Yeah.
It's weighs less than what's powering these light bulbs.
So
And they still pick up the signal.
well, you have to see the size of the antenna that they are using. So
It's amazing.
it has to be filtered, like going up the side where the computers get it out.
I think there are discussions of NASA or JPL is still monitoring the signals from that one, but there's talk about basically just stop monitoring it because they think they've learned as much as they can. Of course, someone at a higher level says, dudes, that was 40 years ago, just let it go. And there's a bunch of scientists saying, no, it could be tomorrow, we'll discover something tremendous. So there's this tension between shut it off and save money, or actually just stop listening to it and save money, or continuing to monitor I think they only really, it does like a dump, like once a week or something. And there's like one person who checks the data and then archives it, but it's a salary and someone's got to pay it. And they're always, everyone's always looking to save money. Someone in upper management is looking at the numbers, so.
The one that has been far away, the most far away from the we have STEM, I mean, it's the farthest STEM.
Yeah, and
It
I
is.
think there's a lot to be said for the notion of 10 minutes after you shut it off or stop listening, that's when something tremendous will happen. You know, I mean, that's Murphy's Law. I mean, so.
Yeah.
As long as the power is still going, like you said, it's nuclear powered, and it is getting mixed down to like less than 10% of. I mean, they have had to shut off certain instruments. They had to decide which ones they want to turn off forever. Because once they get cold and they freeze, you can't turn them back on. And so, yeah, there's only a few instruments still left and functioning. And, you know, if they keep letting it go, they're going to have to make one or two more decisions. And then finally, there should be enough electricity being generated on board the craft to keep it running enough to keep functioning.
Well, now, we have the years, it's not come back. Remember the Star Trek movie?
Oh, yeah.
Well, and then you had that other Star Trek movie where they used like some Klingons use it for target practice. So. Do you have any idea on which instruments are still operable? Like,
I read an article on this like about 9 months ago, and I'm pulling the blankets. I think it's the Fields experiment is still working. It's the long antennas that sense. They used it to figure out where the heliopause is and the heliosphere. Basically, there's the shock wave that moves, the solar wind that moves out from our sun, where it meets the interstellar medium. There's a spot where antenna experiment is still working, last I heard. But I think there might be one other instrument beyond that working, but you know, it's kind of, you know, someone is going to make that decision eventually. And it's out there. It's like, I think, like you said, it's at like 40 or, well, God, it's got to be more than 40 AU. I think it's more like 100 AU by now. Astronomical units. And the time to, yeah, it's got to be days to get an answer back.
well, any other questions or anything that people want to share or talk about? Oh,
well, okay, go ahead.
I have just a question. Because I have heard a lot about the hyperspace, but I'm not sure how it works, or if it's possible, and what is exactly the hyperspace.
well, that's a good question. I don't know. I think it's more theoretical at this point in terms of the idea that you could travel between 2 points without actually conversing the distance between them. But anybody know about hyperspace? That
Just the movie Interstellar. Yeah. No. Which had the best explanation
Well,
I've ever heard of for what a wormhole is like.
yeah.
I was reading on the subject just recently, and there are more and more scientists getting interested in the notion of a drive that basically forms a bubble around a ship and then warps space, and it's the thing where it shows a dip in front of the ship and a peak behind the ship, and that entire bubble moves at superluminal speed. And somehow they explain that as by doing that, the vehicle does not break the laws of physics. The vehicle itself does not exceed the speed of light locally. It's the bubble around the space in space that moves faster. And that all sounds a little bit hand wavy, magic-y to me. But I mean, as a mathematician, you see it. If you have a pair of scissors and you're cutting a piece of paper, the locus, the point where you're cutting the paper, can move faster than light, faster than the speed of light. Supposedly, according to the articles I've read. You know, so,
provided that you can
yeah,
produce the energy required for that.
yeah.
But
That's the problem.
So there was an initial a geometry that was proposed for this vehicle, and someone pointed out that it would require, you know, half of the energy in the known universe to get this vehicle moving up the speed of light. And then again, some more mathematicians and physicists got involved, and they came up with a different geometry. And interestingly, it's basically a ring, and instead of having a ring that was a donut, they just basically said flatten the ring and make it more knife edge in the leading edge direction and the trailing edge direction, and then that got the requirement down to something like a battleship. You need a battleship worth of fuel in order to move this vehicle as fast as the speed of light. And I gotta admit, that's a huge reduction in mass requirement. And so people continue to work on it, and who knows? Maybe
Maybe with it.
right. Yeah, you only make progress. People keep tackling that problem over and over and over. It's only impossible until the first guy figures out how to do it.
and then everybody expected it to happen.
Yeah, and then everyone says, "Oh well, it was just, you know, it was inevitable that we would figure this out." Yeah, someone would do it.
Sorry.
No, I like it. It's a great question.
I would say that they don't just like nuclear power to power those, I know solar power, but the nuclear power, water.
Now, there's a little nuclear power like on the Voyager spacecraft, but also the Perseverance rover and the Curiosity rover are both nuclear powered as well.
It's just radioactive material, so it gives off the warms things up. It's not like a nuclear reactor. There's no fission reaction.
It works on this temperature differential between the hot reactor part and the cold space. And they call it SNAP, Space Nuclear Applications or something. Yeah, and they launched 6 of them, I think, over the years. And they're very safe, even if the rocket blows up, because one of them did, and they managed to go fish the nuclear reactor out of water, I believe, off the coast of Cape Canaveral. And although the rest of the rocket was in tiny little pieces, the nuclear reactor was still intact and hadn't leaked. It was good.
Oh, which
Actually, they reflew it. They flew it again, and it worked just fine.
There is active research going on for nuclear propulsion. They do have a reactor.
Yes, NASA had a project a couple years ago, Prometheus.
Yeah, there's several ongoing ones, both the military and NASA, but they're, you know, that's like 20 or 30 years in the future, but it's ongoing.
The United States had a functioning nuclear rocket back in 1968, 69, 70. That was called the Rover rocket. And they built a series of like 20 different engines. And they got better and better and bigger and more powerful, and more reliable, basically throughout the entire 1960s. And they tested them in a place called Jackass Flats out in Nevada. And there's footage, you can watch them, and they were very efficient. And they had one of them go wrong. One of them blew up, and except it didn't. It blew up, but it wasn't real bad. And so they figured out that this is the worst thing that can happen, you know, with a nuclear rocket engine blowing up, you know, on the surface of the Earth. And it wasn't that bad. They went out there with grabbers, you know, 6-foot-long grabbers, and grabbed the chunks up off and put them on. They used little auto repair shop, those little dollies that the mechanics slide in and out into the cars. They had a couple of those with some buckets, and they just went around and they fished up the pieces. They had a guy over the counter, and got all the pieces and they washed the rest of it down. And I mean, they waited 3 days before starting to do that cleanup process. But by then, they figured it was safe enough to do, and that was the end of that. So they proved that even the worst thing that can happen with a nuclear engine, they tend to degrade gracefully. It doesn't explode like a nuclear bomb. It blows itself, tears itself apart in chunks. And it's called a solid core nuclear reactor, and it's called the NERVA program, Nuclear Engine for Rocket Vehicle Applications. And like I said, they built 20 or 30 of them and ran them just fine. And every time they achieve the engineering goal of, oh well, it has to run an hour, and they say, okay, NASA, let's build one and send it up in orbit. And Congress would come back and say, nah, wait until you can get it to run for 2 hours. Okay. And they went back for another year and they figured out what to do, and they built another one and they got it to run for 2 hours. Okay, now we're ready to go. Nah, make it go to 3 hours, and you have to be able to restart it like 5 times. And so every time they did that over the course of this 10-year period, Congress just kept saying, oh, that's pretty good, but nah. And so they got it to like 1972, and finally Congress said, all right, we'll let you do that. And they had a design that had they were going to put it in the back of the space shuttle, and it had a special exhaust nozzle that would during transit up to orbit, it would be folded over itself, and then when it got in orbit, it would flip over and reconnect with the rest of the nozzle, and then it would be the right size to be used in orbit. And they actually were cutting metal on the flight test article when Congress pulled the plug in, I believe it was 1973. But yes, we have a nuclear rocket engine that works. We have a design that works. It works just fine, and they tested it, and it worked just dandy. And it used nuclear material. It was everything you want a nuclear engine to do. And NASA was even considering using it to go to Mars. But there was other politics involved. There were factions inside of NASA saying, no, we want to do this with chemical rockets instead of nuclear rockets. And that faction basically went out and they canceled the R. It was called RIF, Reactor in Flight Test.
And what was the exhaust from that nuclear rocket?
Real good. It was double what the.
What physically is it?
Oh, the exhaust was hydrogen. They used hydrogen as a fuel, and it doesn't burn.
Right. Okay. They weren't pushing out any nuclear materials, though.
No, not intentionally. No, there was a problem. I mean, cumulatively over time, yeah, it was basically like a myriad of little tiny channels, hexagonal shaped elements, and they would shove the cryogenic liquid oxygen or gasified oxygen, or pardon me, gasified hydrogen at the top of this canister through these elements, and 3 feet later, it went from cryogenic up at the top. 3 feet later, it was like 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, real hot exhaust. And the advantage of it was that it didn't burn. They weren't burning it like hydrogen on the space shuttle. They were just using it as propellant because it's hydrogen. You can get twice as much thrust out of it. It has to do with the mathematics and physics that's involved. But right off the bat, it was good to twice the thrust that we're able to get out of space shuttle main rocket engine, which is one of the most efficient rocket engines that has ever been built and flown. The thing is that yes, over a period of time, your car engine wears down. Same thing with this engine. Over time, you use it enough time, and there's wear in these channels, these through channels going through the engine, that, yeah, there's erosion. And so those channels are drilled through uranium, they're uranium rods. And so, yes, it does spit out a certain amount of, uranium over a period of time. I mean, the engine does wear, and it wears by spitting out particles of itself, which are radioactive.
Well,
So,
Doug, I think we might need a presentation on that, actually.
oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that'd be good.
But yeah, there was also the Timberwind, Project Timberwind under Abrams in 1998 with Star Wars. They came up, and we're talking about a rocket engine that was about the size of a little bit bigger than a trash can, like 55-gallon drum. This rocket engine was that they built, and it was incredibly powerful. And then the guys at built Timberwind, the SDI guys, they built one that was about half the size of that. And it used a different design. It used balls of spheres, packed spheres inside the can, and then they pumped the coolant through. And it was very efficient for as long as it ran. But they had a problem with clogging. There was something there, the hydrogen interacted with the little balls, the coating on the balls, the ball bearings, and it wore out, and then it clogged the outflow channel, the nozzles. But they said they had a solution for that when and they were going to launch it into space, but at that point in time, Congress pulled the plug on SDI. And then there was a project like 8 years after that where they resuscitated it, and it was called Son of Timberwind, the Timberwind 2 reactor. And it apparently, they solved the original problem, and then they had another issue, and they solved that one too. And then there is no more information available anywhere about the status of that project. And one might wonder what it is that they're testing in that X-37 that they don't talk about.
Oh, that would be an interesting idea if they finally went in. Well, we're almost at 4 o'clock. We can stick around and chat, but we probably want to let everybody online go and put the room back to where it was. Masa, do we have anything else that we wanted to talk about? Okay, the one thing is starting next month, we're going to be the second Saturday of every month instead of the first Saturday. So I'll make sure and update everything, but just wanted to put that out there. That'll be the second Saturday from here on out. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you everybody online. Really appreciate it. Oh, and if we could get like a group picture real quick before everybody disappears, and that would be great.